Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping you're seeing my screen here. My name is Monica Jean. I am a field crops educator for Michigan State University Extension, and today you are on virtual breakfast. And as Phil said, there's like three more left, which means harvest is coming. With that, today we have Dennis Pennington getting on. He is our wheat specialist. And then if you know Dennis, you know he pretty much knows everything wheat. He's a great resource and he does a really nice job working with our growers. We really appreciate it here. So Dennis, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing, and you're gonna tell us all how to make, 120 bushel wheat, right?
Of course I am.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Like Monica said, I'm Dennis Pennington, Weed Extension Specialist for Michigan State University. We've got about 15 minutes here to talk about wheat, and then after that we get the weather report and whatnot. We'll have time for some question and answers. So as I go through, please type your questions in that chat box, and I'd be happy to answer them either live or I can try to type responses into the chat box too. So before I get started, we're going to talk about tips to achieve high yields, but I thought I'd share this with you. This is equipment company had a coloring contest, and what's wrong with this picture? What do you notice? Anything in particular? Notice it says Case IH right here, and what color did they color this? Green and yellow. So anyway, I thought that was kind of funny. I thought I'd share that with you. But enough of the hooligan stuff. So, all right, let's get started. I want to talk to you first about managing residue behind the combine because we are headed into harvest, and that's one important aspect that we need to deal with so that we can do a good job planting our wheat crop. We'll talk just a bit about drill or planter adjustments and settings, and then I want to reiterate the importance of planting on time. We'll talk just a touch about starter fertilizer and the value of starter fertilizer in the fall. And then I want to wrap up with just a comment about innovation on your farm. So let's get started. I guess the first thing I wanted to talk about was spreading residue. Now notice in this picture, these combines are doing a pretty decent job of spreading the residue. You can see that residue spread almost the full width of the header. And notice back here, there's only maybe a 5 or 8 foot wide swath where there's no residue. So when you think about going in and planting wheat, how is that planter going to plant in this area with no residue versus the area that has the residue? Now, like I said, in this particular field, this isn't all that bad as far as the residue spread, but we've all seen cases where that residue being spread is spread in a pretty narrow path, and there's a pretty wide space in between where there's no residue left on that surface. So if you're piling up residue in a swath like this, that will create some challenges for you when you're getting into planting. So it's very important that you set your combine so that you're spreading that full width of that head. And the width of these heads just keeps increasing. I'm hearing a 50-foot wide draper heads now. But if you can only spread 40 feet wide with the spreader that you've got on the back of the combine, you really ought to only have a 40-foot wide head. So try to either size your head based on how far you can spread that, or you need to invest. There are some aftermarket things you can do on a chopper spreader in the back of the combine that will allow you to spread that residue. And then the other thing too that's important is chopping it. You want to chop that residue as fine as possible. So make sure your knives are sharp going into the season, and you keep them sharp. And if you have anything going wrong with it, just keep an eye on it and check it. And it's not hard to just check this spread pattern. You can see it as you're combining in the field. And if you're starting to see a residue pile up in a particular area, you need to go on the back and look at what's going on and get things fixed and working right. So getting this residue spread the full width is going to be pretty important for preparing a seed bed to plant your wheat. So here's another example. Notice you can see these strips where the residue was swathed. Now notice that the tillage here has been done on a little bit of an angle. You can kind of see the angle of the tillage. This was done with a field cultivator in this field, but look at how thick this residue, and even in places like this right here, there's residue pretty thick right in here. So if I'm planting into this heavy residue, you can get things like this happening. Notice you got seed here that's germinating and starting to emerge, and you can see the seed. We weren't able to get the row closed in this picture. Notice there is residue or soybean stems like here and here that are getting hairpinned down into the bottom of the furrow. This is one thing you want to avoid is this kind of a scenario. So if you have high residue, you've got to figure out a management system where you can deal with this. And the other thing that you notice the length of some of the stems on this residue. You can't see it everywhere in the picture, but some of these stems don't look like they've even been chopped up at all. It looks like they came out of the back of the combine and got spread just a little ways. Tillage on an angle might help to drag that residue and spread it out a little bit, but you can clearly see that it didn't do enough to spread that residue out. So here's another example. This is in a no-till field. This was actually a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. Notice there's quite a lot of corn stalks left in here. So if you've got high residue scenario like this, making sure, particularly with no-till, you've got enough downforce pressure. Right here's the row. You can see some seed here, but this is the row that was planted. And if I zoom in, look at, if I move that soybean leaf right there, shoot, you can see a bunch of seed and the furrow isn't closed. So depending on the situation, in terms, the soil moisture has an impact, the cropping history, how much tillage you do or don't do, all of those things are going to impact the seed bed that you're trying to get your wheat planted into. And then of course, if you have something like this, you've got to fix these. Even if you're no-till, you still have to fix this before you can plant your wheat. So when you're planting your wheat, the planter is opening up a furrow here. And where do you want that seed to be placed? Do you want that seed to be placed right there? No, you want that seed to be placed at the bottom of the furrow, and you want to do that consistently. So imagine if there's residue and things in here that might cause this row unit to pop up and down. You want to make sure you have enough downforce, and your disc openers are set in a way that allow you to cut this slot consistently and get that seed dropped in the bottom of that slot consistently. So whatever the system you have, you want to make the adjustments on your planter or your drill so that and go out and test it. Go out and make sure, dig up some seed in a row and see what it looks like. Your planting depth, your target should be about 1.25 to 1.5 inches deep. So make sure that when you're checking your settings, that you're checking your seed depth as well. So, and here's just a picture where I picked up the closing wheels on the back of one of our planters. And what do you think about that distribution of the seed? Do you like it? Do you not like it? What do you notice? Well, there's definitely some gaps, and there's some spots where, I don't know if you'd consider this to be a double right here, but that seed's pretty close together with a gap right here. So that the plant from this seed is going to tiller out more than the plant from these seeds that are real close together. So just pay attention to what your planter is doing and check it periodically, because field conditions vary. Field to field varies based on residue and whether you get rain in between and so on. So make sure you're constantly checking this. I borrowed this from Peter Johnson. There's a couple things I wanted to point out in this picture. There's a couple things, and this shows basically different planting depths. So here's your seed, and this is showing planting depths going from like at the surface down to about 2 to 2.5 inch depth. And one thing to notice, look at the GDDs. If you're planted at the surface, it only takes 80 GDDs for that plant to emerge. And then as you go deeper, 105, 130, 150, 175, 200. So the deeper you plant, the more GDDs it's going to take for that to emerge. That is why when you're planting later in the season, it takes more days. So if you're planting in the optimum here and it takes 130 GDDs to accumulate, you'll accumulate 130 GDDs in the last week in September and maybe 4 or 5 days, 6 days. Whereas if you're planting in the last week of October, it might take you 14, 18 days, 21 days to accumulate that 130 GDDs. The other thing that's important in this picture is we know that wheat has crown roots, right? And where do you want those crown roots to be placed? Do you want them up at the soil surface? Do you want them just below the surface? Well, you want them to be in that half inch or so below the soil surface, which means you got to get your seed planted deep enough to do that because those crown roots are very important in providing anchorage for the plant. We had this year probably more lodging than we've had in the past. So growers are more, we haven't really had a big lodging problem for a couple years here, but if you're planting shallow and those crown roots are closer to the surface, that is increasing the potential risk for lodging. So just keep that in mind. So here's a picture. What do you think about this kind of emergence? Do you like this? Is this uniform? Would you be happy with that? Here's another one. Notice this one seems to be a little bit more uniform, but the seeding rate is also quite a bit higher in here. So the goal would be to get these plants germinated and emerged in the spacing within the row as uniform as possible. You want to avoid these big gaps in places where seed were placed kind of on top of each other. So let's move on to planting date. Planting date is very important. This picture was taken on December 11th, and this was wheat planted on September 15th, October 1, October 15th, November 1, and then November 15th. And you wouldn't think that just a 2 week window between October 1 and October 15th would make that big of a deal. But look at the number of tillers on this plant. You got your main stem and you got 1, 2, 3, about probably 4 tillers on this plant. 14 days later, how many tillers do you have on this plant? Absolutely none. So in this picture is taken December 11th, you're not going to get much tiller development after December 11th before, green up in the spring. So this little narrow window, if you get behind that window, you run the risk of not having much for tiller development. And then, planting 1st of November, it's barely emerged from the soil. And then November 15th, taken, well, I guess December 11th, that's not quite a month difference. But it's just, it has germinated, but not even close to being emerged. So just to reiterate the importance of planting date, I'll show you this planting date and seeding rate. And I shared this a number of times before, but it's powerful and it shows the value of planting date. So this was a planting dates and seeding rate study where we had 5 different planting dates, and these will be the lines that will appear here. I just put up planting date 1. So this is the yield on this axis. And then on the bottom, we go from 0.8 all the way up to 2.4 million seeds per acre in 400,000 seeds per acre increments. So at 0.8 million seeds per acre on planting date 1, we got a yield just north of 160. In the same planting date, we went to 1.2 million seeds per acre, 1.6, 2, and 2.4. How much benefit do we get from increasing the seeding rate? Not a lot. So here's planting date 2. How much benefit did we get from increasing the seeding rate and planting date 2? Not a lot. Yield potential on both planting date 1 and 2 are pretty similar up here, but look what happens when we go to planting date 3. This is that October 15th time. Doesn't matter what we do to seeding rate, we cannot get back up to the yield potential of our first 2 planting dates, and it just gets worse from there. So when you get out to planting date 5, which is November 15th, so the planting dates are September 15th, October 1, October 15, November 1, and November 15th. you're seeing a bit of a response to the seeding rate on these two later planting dates, but not so much on the first three. And so here's the agronomically optimum seeding rates for by planting date. So I can share that later on because a lot of people want that information. But we can plant less seed, but the importance of planting on time is very, very important because if you're not planting on time, there's no amount of management that will allow you to get back to this kind of yield potential. If you're planting late down here, you've set your yield bar, and it's almost impossible to raise that bar higher. So the last thing I wanted to just mention is the value of starter fertilizer, whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Generally, you get more benefit when you're planting early. This is just a couple of strips where we had a couple planting dates. This is the late planting date. I'll show you the early planting date in a minute. This did not have phosphorus in the starter. This one had 50 pounds of P in the starter. It was broadcast incorporated. Notice the value of the phosphorus in here in the late planted. And this was planted on October 31st. So here's the same trial planted early. Notice that you get a lot more benefit from that starter fertilizer when you plant early compared to when you plant late. And you'll see the same trend in terms of nitrogen as well as sulfur when you're doing that. So we used to think, and that was part of the reason why we did this study, is like, well, if we're planting late, we need to bump up our fertilizer. That's just not necessarily true. You get more benefit when you're planting early. So I just wanted to wrap up. How are farmers getting this 160 bushel yield? Well, they're innovative. These high yield growers, there's certain things that they can do very, very well. Number one, they can identify things that limit yield and then overcome it. Not everybody can go out there and look at a crop and identify what are the things in my field in this year that are limiting yield. If you don't go out and pay attention to your crop and don't go look, you're never going to know what's limiting your yield. These growers are also always looking for new equipment, products, practices, anything that they can change or test on their farm. Try something new. If they're seeing a positive response on their farm, they implement it. So they test this stuff on their farm for 2 to 3 years. If it makes them money, it becomes part of their standard program. They don't run the same program year after year after year without making changes. It's all about trying to figure out what you can do to improve yields on your farm. So I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll answer questions at the end.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, so much. Okay, so first question coming in, Dennis. Peter asked, how much yield do I lose from that inconsistent seed distribution in the row? And how do I avoid this happening with a controlled spill device?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I can give you or quantify a amount of yield loss, but it's considerable, the amount of yield loss by having variability in that planting. And with a controlled spill, you just got to do the best job you can with your metering system to make sure you're metering out seed properly. You need to check each row unit, make sure they're metering the same. If you've got an air seeder where you've got the seed bin and a metering system that distributes or blows the seed down tubes to each row unit, just make sure you're calibrated so you're putting out the right amount. But there's not a whole lot you can do to force seed to be singulated. There are some guys that are planting wheat with like a 10-inch row spacing soybean planter. They just buy wheat plates for it, and then they are able to actually pick up individual wheat seeds and try to singulate it. But the accuracy of singulation just isn't nearly as good on wheat as what it is on soybeans and corn, because they're planting a lot lower populations of seed per acre than what we are. And so those metering units have to spin 4, 5, 6 times faster, higher RPMs to plant the populations we need. And when those things spin that fast, it's hard to pick up that seed. So, Peter, I don't know if you want to open up your mic and maybe you have a better idea on potential yield loss from, from that inconsistency in planting. But it's considerable.
Oh, Dennis, I have no idea. And it's actually your data or Manny's data that would suggest the singulation can give you that maybe 8 or 10% yield gain, but how we get there is a real challenge. And so is broadcast and incorporation giving me better singulation? And does that actually end up with a higher yield as opposed to road wheat?
Yeah, so that's a good question. With the Broadcast Incorporated, we've done some trials on that. And in terms of singulation, the goal with singulation is that you're trying to achieve uniform distance between the seeds. Singulation helps you get closer to that, achieving uniform distance between your seeds. With Broadcast Incorporating, it's kind of random. You're not forcing seed to be in a row. So it does improve your seed to seed spacing, but as you know, it's completely random. And then when you're incorporating, that incorporation will plant seed anywhere from the surface all the way down to the depth of tillage. And so most guys are running or setting their high speed discs that are broadcasting seed on, to till down to that, say, 3 inches or so. And then that way they're trying to get seed down in that 1.5 inch range, but it's the depth is just completely random. So that's the negative of that, but that is the negative of having inconsistent depth is offset by the ability of those plants to tiller out and produce more heads per plant, because they're randomly distributed and they're able to tiller more. When you force them in a row, that brings those seeds closer together. In comparing, just a 7.5 inch row spacing drill to Broadcast Incorporated, in every trial and every location and every year, there was no statistical difference between those two yields. So they were equal. But when you compare the precision planter on a narrow row, it beats it every time. That precision planting on narrow row on 5 inch row spacing will beat the drill, and it'll beat Broadcast Incorporated in every trial we've ever done. We've done quite a few.
I was going to point out that was Wheat Pete, but I didn't know if I should reveal that. So there you go. He revealed himself, Dennis. Thanks for getting on. All right. I wanted to mention real quick as we're doing questions that Jeff does have a class he has to teach. So he'll have to get off a couple minutes early here. So if you do have a Jeff question, asking now would be good. And I'm going to go ahead and skip over some questions to get to the Jeff question. And so someone did ask about the Aurora information. And I see, Jeff, you pasted it in there, and I will put it in the notes too, posted to the
Okay.
podcast if you're looking for the link as well.
Yeah,
So,
have a look, especially at that first one, and there's more than I think any 99.99% of the people would ever expect to ask or wonder about. It's a really for this though, it's really helpful.
okay. Well, I used to have an app on my phone to help when I lived in the UP. I didn't think it was that accurate. I
Oh,
never saw them, and I've
yeah.
now seen them without trying down here. So
And
I
also
think
remember
that's pretty
there is a weather
exciting.
part of it too
Yeah.
and that is, yes, there might be aurora there, but you've got to have a clear sky or relatively to be able to take advantage of see it. So it's a conditional too. It's a couple
Yeah.
things that need to work out.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Sure.
And just for the people like listening and not seeing, one is actually auroraforecast.com. That one's really easy. And the other one is swpc.noaa.gov backslash no splash. Ooh. All right. So let's move. I think that was the only weather one I saw right now, Jeff. So
Okay,
thank you.
you
And
bet.
when you if to get off for class, no big deal.
All right.
All right, so going up to the top, Brandon asked, what is a good dry fertilizer recipe target for a starter?
So that's a good question. For starter, phosphorus and potassium, you want to make applications based on soil test information. So you want to base your P and K on what your soil test levels are. So if your soil test levels are low, you'd be in a build scenario where you need to apply more than what the crop is removing. If you have high soil test levels, if it's high enough, you might be able to back off your P and K a little bit. But as far as dry fertilizer, I would say the majority of the phosphorus, that probably is enough nitrogen for fall, particularly if you're planting later. There's no benefit of adding nitrogen if you're planting late. Now, if you're planting early, you could add some urea to that blend and maybe bump that up to maybe 30 pounds of total N per acre. But there's not a huge benefit of putting, a lot of nitrogen out there in the fall. Phosphorus, generally around that 50 pounds of P per acre. So if you're putting MAP out, you put out 100 or 105 pounds of MAP per acre, you're going to get that along with 11 pounds of nitrogen. Potash, a lot of guys are putting out, the blend that they'll put out is 100 pounds of MAP plus 150 of potash. And then for sulfur, you want to get about 20 pounds of sulfur out there. That's more than what the crop removes, but that sulfur isn't 100% protected. It can move in the soil like nitrogen. But in the studies, in fact, I was just talking to Kurt Steinke yesterday at our meeting, and he's finding that probably his recommendation would be there's greater benefit from the sulfur fertilizer in the fall compared to the spring. There are certain weather conditions that can change that. But in general, in the long run, for all the years he's done these studies, put that sulfur on in the fall. And about 20 pounds is a good target. I have some growers putting on more than that. And in the end program, if you look at sulfur removal, it's between 10 and 20 pounds per acre. Is generally what that crop is removing. So that's what I got for dry fertilizer in the fall.
Did I pick out of there? I didn't know if I heard it, the magnesium response and if there's conditions.
Yeah, no, magnesium. Typically you would find magnesium deficiency on a lighter textured acidic soil. And the best recommendation in that scenario is to use dolomitic lime to adjust your soil pH. As long as you got, a proper pH, generally there's not a lot of magnesium deficiency in the state, but if there is, there are some magnesium fertilizers that you can apply. But that would be more of a rare scenario than commonplace.
Okay, and then one more hitting on this, liquid versus dry. So liquid in furrow versus surface drop broadcast. Yeah,
so I did this with MAP 1152.0. So I did and 1034.0 thiol or ammonium sulfate. So with 1034.0, that's the liquid. I put it on. The target was 50 pounds of P per acre. So I calibrated the 1034.0 plus the MAP at 50 pounds per acre. And I did broadcast on the surface, then incorporated, and then I also had treatments where those went in the furrow with the seed. I was a little bit concerned because to get the 50 pounds of P with the 1034.0, that was 12.6 gallons per acre. I also added a treatment in the furrow of half rate, 6.3. So that was only 25 pounds of P per acre. There were no statistical differences in the yields from any of them. I know that there are some that believe that putting that phosphorus in the furrow gives you a significant benefit. You'd have to have probably a lower soil test level. You'd need to be below that 40 ppm Bray P1 soil test level before you'd see significant benefit of putting that in the furrow. So broadcast in the furrow doesn't really matter, dry versus liquid. As long as you're calibrating to get the same nutrient amount with the product, there's not a big difference at all.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to take a pause on that and do a little round robin. I see there's one more question, but I want to make sure for the other specialists jump off just to see if there's any big updates in the field. And so if Cristofanzo is still on, and she is, we have a
I
question.
don't have much. I cut some corn this week and I found hardly any Western bean cutworms, a little bit of earworm. This was sweet corn that was specifically looking for caterpillars. And so it's been pretty quiet out there. And we're kind of ahead on insects. We're like three weeks ahead. So a lot of stuff you might see now has already finished. And so I don't, if any of your children are in my class and they're collecting insects, it might be a really hard class because there's surprisingly not so much out there as you would expect. So
Someone did ask about Japanese beetle and when the first instar larvae are active in Southeast Michigan.
So Japanese beetles emerge, well, this year, where I started to see them at the end of June. So they would have egg laid, and by fall, so say by September, you would have third instars, which are the last instar, and that's what will overwinter. So there's probably at least seconds now, and maybe some early thirds that are from the first egg laying. So I think we're probably past first instar for most places
Okay.
in southern Michigan.
All right. Thank you so much. Chris, is Marty still on? I know I'm getting
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. I
I'm
know I
here.
sent you a question about standability, how to test that
Yeah.
and how your corn's doing with tar spot. Do you have any more updates too?
So yeah, I mean, I think tar spot pressure's been pretty light across the state this year. Certainly, it's no surprise that pressure will pick up as the season finishes, and as those corn plants get to maturity, things that were resisting disease tend to sort of give up, and you'll just see increase on that leaf tissue. But as long as it's pretty late, it shouldn't really affect standability. But if you have any concerns, get out and do some push tests to see how your fields are looking and plan accordingly for harvest.
Okay.
So that's
Yeah.
what I have.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about white mold. It seems like the levels aren't as bad. I do have some irrigated fields that's, looking worse.
Yeah, there's definitely pockets in the state. So, I mean, now is a really good time just to assess, for where you have white mold in what fields, and make sure you make a note of that so that you can find the notes, in a couple of years when you go to plant soybeans again and plan accordingly for variety resistance and fungicides and whatnot. The only other thing I did want to make a quick mention of, I guess, is red crown rot of soybeans. So this has not been confirmed in Michigan. It looks a lot like SDS on the plant, but the lower part of the stem will have some red discoloration. If you have any questions at all, please, collect a sample, send us some photos, because we want to get on top of this. It's in Indiana and Illinois, and I think it's going to do a lot of damage to our soybeans when it gets here. So just keep an eye open for that.
All right. Thank you, Marty. That was a good PSA. I like it. All right. Do we have any other specialists on who have a little update they would like to share? Otherwise, I'm going to switch back to Dennis to finish up questions here in our last couple minutes. Hearing none, Dennis, I will say that I had someone comment about fumigation classes. I currently don't have a link to plop in there for you, but I will say Jenna Failer is working pretty hard on doing seed treatment and fumigation class credits for those license. And so she does plan on offering something. I just don't quite know what it is, and I don't think she's on. I went ahead and gave her the email address. But if you have questions, like reach out to me or her and make sure I can get you to Jenna, because we do know that's a need and we are working on addressing it. Okay, are you noticing differences in tillering potential among varieties? If yes, is that info available?
The short answer is yes, there is a difference, and that information should be available from your seed company, wherever you're buying your seed from. However, the longer story is that there are a lot of things that affect tillering. And when you think about the G by E by M, genetics by environment by management, the genetics plays only a small role in determining the number of tillers. Management and environment play probably a bigger role. So things like your seeding rate, um, row spacing, and planting date are going to have probably a greater impact on the number of tillers um, than what you'll see in differences from variety to variety. So I guess the short answer is yeah, there is some differences, but with management, you can completely change the number of heads per meter squared by changing management practices. So it's not just variety.
Okay. And then I don't know if Kurt's on, but there was a comment just about the sulfur problem really, becoming an issue in our rotations. It's kind of a problem of a good thing, right? We've cleaned up our air. But yeah, I didn't think I saw Kurt, but yes, it is becoming something we need to apply more regularly now because of that. And the next question is, can you put thiosol in liquid fall application in furrow behind the press wheel liquid? What fertilizers cannot be put in row behind row? In row / behind row?
Yeah, so the important thing with putting fertilizer in furrow is the salt index, and you've got to be very careful to not you can burn the plant, and then you'll have the damage will be not worth the value of having the fertilizer there. And thiosol, I don't know that I know anybody that's ever done that, putting that in the furrow because of the salt index. So that might be a good question for Kurt to answer. He can answer that better than I can, but I don't think I would put thiosol in the furrow. There's growers that are putting thio on in the spring for their sulfur with their nitrogen. They're 28%. They're mixing 28% UAN and ATS in the tank, but that not in the furrow. I would not do that in the furrow.
Any other questions? I do see there's a answer or a question about understanding how many credits you have. It is on the MDARD website, Tom, and this is always a pretty good reminder. So you can get on the MDARD website and look it up. I'm trying to find the link right now, actually.
Monica, I can send that to Tom after we're done
Okay.
here because we're
coming up against the end here,
Yep.
and I'm not finding it quickly. So, it looks like one more question, then we'll be done. You squeaked it right in there, Kevin, and that is, has anyone tried incorporating oat radish cover crop in wheat stubble with a chisel plow? Does it bury the seed too deep to emerge? I don't mind making an extra pass with vertical tillage tool to incorporate. Well,
I don't have any experience with that.
yeah,
So
I would
can't
also
say.
be concerned that it would, I don't know, Phil, have you seen anyone incorporate with a chisel plow?
chisel plows go a little deep, and
Yeah.
I'm very concerned that you're going to bury that seed and not get the emergence that you want. And then, you've got the cost of the seed that's been lost. So uh, I would I would be hesitant. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way.
I would actually, if there's a way to put it on and not, not incorporate it at all at that point, I think moisture is important for that to take off as a broadcast. But if there's a way that, if you need to till, but somehow you can go ahead and spread that afterwards with your system and then not worry about tillage, after that. And if that would help with your past situation, I would consider doing something like that more so than burying it that deep.
The only caveat I would add to that, there is some people with putting like an air seeder, mounting it on tillage equipment. I suppose if you mounted that and you blew that seed on behind the chisel plow, you might be successful in doing that because
Yes.
then it would be kind of like
Yes.
broadcasting it on the surface.
You articulated that much better than me. Thank you, Dennis. I think I'm still waking up, but that is exactly what I was. Yes. Yeah. We did retrofit an air seeder, kind of like what Dennis is describing up at the UP Research Station. I have some pictures. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to send you along some photos of how they went ahead and did that. But that is a system that has worked. The bummer is if there's not a lot of moisture, then they don't take off that great either. All right, we are at time. We're actually past time. Usually Phil closes us out at 8 o'clock, whether I'm talking or not. So, Peter did ask about a salt index. I don't know if there's a quick comment you have on that, Dennis, but we got to close her down.
No, he just plugged in the salt index. So ammonium thiosulfate's 90 compared to 1034O at 20. Huge difference.
Yes.
That's why you don't put ATS in the furrow.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for getting on. I think it's the 23rd one for the season, if I remember correctly. And so thank you for getting on, and we hope to see you next week. Have a good week, everyone.